The 1970s was a decade where political events highly impacted the society outside of the government. By the second half of President Nixon's first term in office, he had already pushed to take down many of Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society reforms by abolishing the Office of Economic Opportunity and other major programs. This was part of Nixon's New Federalism, in which, as a conservative, he worked to restore power to local and state government. As an example of Nixon's New Federalism, he passed the State and Local Assistance Act in 1972, which allowed states and local government to decide for themselves how to spend federal dollars rather than being told by the government. His action spurred a rise in conservatism in American society.
A greater political issue for Nixon in the early 1970s decade, however, was his dealings with the Vietnam War, which was rapidly losing popularity in the eyes of the American public. Riots broke out in several universities across the United States in response to the dehumanizing images and propaganda of the events in Vietnam. The My Lai massacre and the Christmas bombings especially soured the public toward the war, in several cases breaking out into violence. On May 4, 1970, violence erupted after the National Guard opened fire on rioters on the Kent State University campus after President Nixon announced an invasion of Cambodia. Vietnam was only one of the few questionable issues present for the election of 1972. Running on a ticket with Senator Spiro Agnew, Richard Nixon won in a landslide over Democrat George McGovern and his vice presidential nominee Thomas F. Eagleton. Nixon proposed policies to restore local and state power, to create more stable international relations, and to defend traditional values.
A major economic and political issue of the early 70s was the gas crisis. The countries of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, decided to stop exporting to Israeli-supporting countries, which included the U.S. They then raised prices by over 400%. This caused a major fuel crisis in the United States, spurred inflation, and exposed America's immense foreign dependency. Nixon tried to ease the problems through reforms that conserved fuel, like a 55-mile-per-hour speed limit on highways. But American citizens continued to feel the effects as oil and gas prices stayed immensely high. In addition, several auto part plants and dealerships shut down or laid off workers. Over 27 million new jobs were created throughout the 70s in order to help ease the effects of this crisis. Nixon also tried to lessen inflation by freezing wages and prices and adding taxes on foreign goods. He hoped that this would cause the population to buy more U.S. products. The ongoing economic struggle, dubbed stagflation because it's a combination of inflation and stagnation, would continue on into the 80s and still stumps leaders today. On June 17, 1972, the Democratic National Committee's headquarters was breached in the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. The acts that occurred at the Watergate building would soon tarnish Nixon's reputation and would be elevated to even worse levels when Vice President Spiro Agnew, later replaced by Gerald Ford, was under extreme fire for receiving kickbacks as the former Maryland governor. Nixon later resigned in 1974, the first in history, and was replaced by Gerald Ford. This epic scandal created public mistrust in leaders and overshadows Nixon's positive accomplishments to this day.
Only 2 short years later, the United States had another new president. The election of 1976 put Ford, who barely took the Republican nomination over Reagan, and Vice President Robert Dale against Democrat James Earl Jimmy Carter and his vice presidential nominee Walter Mondale. Ford's unpopularity, which had greatly increased when he had pardoned Nixon, his weak policies, and failed attempts to fix the gas crisis, lost him the election. Jimmy Carter entered office and made plans to balance tax burdens. He proposed the first revision of the income tax in over 30 years, which resulted in several tax revolts in 1978. He also created a new federal Department of Energy, which investigated other forms of energy such as wind, solar, and nuclear power, an idea that caused much controversy after the 7 Mile Island meltdown in 1979.
The 60s environmental and feminist movement were continued into the 70s. The first Earth Day, which received endorsements from most politicians, took place in the 1970s. That same year, Congress passed the Clean Air Act, and 2 years later, the Clean Water Act. This signified that the government was finally supporting environmental causes which are still prominent.
Affirmative action was extended to women, and colleges such as Yale and Harvard opened their doors to female students. Gloria Steinem created the National Women's Political Caucus in 1971, which encouraged women to seek political offices. The Supreme Court decision in Roe v. Wade in 1973 made abortion legal, a major victory for the feminist movement. The Equal Rights Amendment was also proposed in 1972, but failed to gain ratification before its 1982 deadline. Women currently can and do go to major Ivy League colleges, choose to have an abortion, or hold political office because of the successes in the women's rights movement of the 70s. However, not all of society displayed support in the growing feminist and environmental movements. In 1974, Richard Viguerie developed the Conservative Communications and Fundraising Organization. Soon it had over 4 million members, and the Conservatives were better funded than all other opponents. Other conservative groups and supporters included evangelical Christians, suburbanites, and the Sun Belt. No, not that belt. A collection of regions predominantly in the Southwest that grew in conservatism.
Blacks continued to receive success in gaining rights in the Supreme Court case Swan versus the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education in 1971. The court ruling established new public school bus guidelines that promoted integration and racial balance in schools. Bakke versus the Regents of the University of California in 1978 banned racial quotas in the admission process, but the court did say that race could still be considered a factor. The American Indian movement gained momentum in the 1970s. Russell Means led the movement, and in 1972 started the Trail of Broken Treaties. This was a protest against all of the treaties between Indians in the U.S. that were broken by the latter, that also called for 100 million acres of land and the abolition of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. In response, the Indian Education Act of 1972 and the Indian and Self-Determination Act of 1975 were passed in order to grant more freedom for American Indians in deciding their tribal affairs. The Supreme Court case, the United States versus Wheeler, in 1978, confirmed that Native tribes had independent legal standing and could not be terminated by Congress.
The 70s were also a decade full of dramatic crimes and cases outside of the Supreme Court. The decade opened with the trial of Charles Manson and his family. In 1969, he had sent his band of hippie followers, mostly consisting of teenage girls, on a killing spree. He alleged that the killings were necessary to start Helter Skelter, or the end of the world. Or, in his own words,
do you feel blame? Are you mad? Do you feel like Wolf's Kebab's right friends? Get friends,
The case received much media attention because of the barbaric brutality of the crime, including messages written in the victim's blood and the murder of 8 months pregnant actress Sharon Tate. The trial was a media circus due to Manson's antics, such as carving an X in his forehead and leaping at the judge while the girls chanted. In 1971, Manson and 3 young girls were sentenced to death. But the next year, in Furman v. Georgia, the Supreme Court overturned existing capital punishment statutes and established strict new guidelines for those in the future. Thus, the Manson clan remains in prison to this very day, a constant reminder of the dangers of hippies, 60s, and cults. Unfortunately, this warning was not well heeded, for in 1978, in Jonestown, Guyana, 909 members of the People's Temple died in what has been called the largest mass suicide in modern history. The mastermind behind this was Jim Jones, who made everyone drink Kool-Aid laced with cyanide in order to be religiously saved. Once again, the nation was shocked at Americans' easy coercion into cults and the barbarity of the crime, as young children were poisoned as well.